Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Thank you for joining me in this live stream entitled Emmanuel Levinas Thinking in Hebrew and the Role or Concept of Testimony within Philosophy. So, this is a great privilege to be talking about the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, to continue to unpack his philosophy, investigate his philosophy, and think along with him. So, thank you again for joining me. It's a great pleasure to be together in this philosophical adventure. So, to start off, we want to think about Levinas and how he envisions, how he understands phenomenality. So, the self in relation to the other. Um, in so many projects in Western philosophy, we have the self at the center of things. And even for phenomenology, everything comes to the self is central. Like the self is the sun of its own solar system. And so we have a circular shape in most philosophy, the self at the center, the ego in the middle of things. But with Levinas, it is not so. We have something quite different. And he's not, again, inventing it. It's through the method of phenomenology that Levinas is bringing to thought this more primary fundamental relationship between, yes, there is a self, but there's also the other. And when it comes to the other, we don't have a simple egalitarian relationship. We have the other proceeding from a height of exteriority and transcendence. And the other calls to me, the call of the other to the self. So again, we have the self here and the other. The accent is on the other for Levinas, and it's an asymmetrical relationship as he describes it. And so to be human, to be a self, is to recognize one's vocation as a perpetual ascent toward the heights, the transcendence of the other. We have an elliptical shape then of conscious life. It's not just a circular one that proceeds by way of the hermeneutical circle all the time. But for Levinas, we have an ethical state of affairs always, already. And it looks like this. It's an elliptical shape. And the other is primary. The other in relation to the self calls to the self. And the self, again, this intentionality is secondary for Levinas, like it is in Husserl, like it is in Marion. And the intentionality then is meant to be a response of responsibility for the other, a being for the other, not as in Heidegger, a being toward death, but being for the other, not just being in the world, but being in relation to the other. This is quite different between Levinas and Heidegger. So we have this going on. And in a previous live stream, I talked about Levinas and how he thinks the infinite, or better said, lets the infinite be thought in him. How does the idea of the infinite come to mind? The idea of the infinite does not come to mind directly, but comes via the other and the call of the other to the self. How so? Because the other does not stop calling me. The ethical imperative is everlasting. It comes from a diachronic past to which I have no immediate access, and yet it comes to me through the signification of the face of the other, the call of the other, this ethical situation itself, in which this responsibility for the other has an infinite quality. So I'll just draw the symbol of the infinite. It goes on and on and on. My responsibilities are never finished concerning the other. As long as I have breath in my lungs, as long as my heart is beating, there's an infinite summons of responsibility, infinite tasks of responsibility for the other. Existence for the other, a life that is coming through the other, the call of the other in this ethical situation. Other language of Levinas here is the saying, which is directly related to the infinite in his philosophy. And the saying comes through the dialogue between the other and oneself that Levinas calls the said. The said takes place in this intersubjective relationship. All the stuff of language, of history, of culture, of colloquialisms, everything that's happening between the other and the self is part of the said. That itself is signification of the saying, the infinite, the foundation of all phenomenality. This saying that is not directly accessible to thought, but shows up as a trace within the said of discourse, of language, of interpretation, of dialogue. So we want to reposition all these things with Levinas as we continue to think with him about the category of testimony, the concept of testimony, attestation within this framework, this ethical framework of every lived experience. For Levinas, every lived experience is situated within this context, within this milieu, within this ethical fabric of relationship. So today we're thinking about the saying and the said a bit more, but also the role of testimony. And so something like prophecy, which tends to be a religious concept, something in theology, Levinas, it finds a place in his own philosophy. What is prophecy? It's the voice of the other within the self. And so when the self, for Levinas, says, here I am in relation to the call of the other, that's prophecy. It's this call of the other welling up in the self as response, as lived responsibility. So the linguistic signification, here I am, is provoked, is produced by the call of the other. This is quite different than René Descartes, who says, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. For Levinas, it's you call, therefore I am. The self comes into operation as an effect from the call of the other. The self is born into its own ethical living because of the call of the other, without sounding too metaphysical. I had a metaphysical slip and I said because. So I try not to say that. The call of the other arouses the vocation of the self. So when the self says, here I am in relation to the other, this language is provoked, it proceeds from the other first. And Levinas says that the other in French is the first comer, le premier venu, the first comer within phenomenality, within lived experience. The other is the first comer, le premier venu. So that's what phenomenology is after. What is first? Not is what happens first? What happens first within lived experience? For Levinas, the call of the other is first, and therefore generates this entire matrix of lived experience. So let's think along with him more. Levinas, taking from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, and Etude in Phenomenology, forward by Jean-Luc Marion. This section on testimony to glory, the ambiguity of every said. So this relationship between saying and said in the work of Levinas, it's an important stage of analysis of his thinking of proclamation and attestation to focus on the place of testimony in relation to the saying and the said. First of all, for Levinas, he writes in his book Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, saying is witness. It is saying without the said, a sign given to the other, a fraternity, a proximity that is possible only as an openness of self, an imprudent exposure to the other, a passivity without reserve, to the point of substitution. To the point of substitution on the part of the self, on the part of the ego. So if we were to bring out the diagram again, how are we interpreting what he's saying here? So he starts by saying is witness. What he means by this is that there's a precipitation of the saying through the said, and the saying is detected through its signification, through the said, and when the ego becomes witness to the saying, witness to the infinite, witness to the signification of the infinite and the saying through the call of the other, that transpires through the concreteness of all the language said between these interlocutors. But the self is witness to the primordiality, the anteriority, the priority of the call of the other. The self is the witness of all of this advent of the infinite, through the call of the other. So the self as witness. And the saying without the said is a sign given to the other. There's a sign of which I am the witness. The call of the other as sign pointing to the infinite, pointing to the saying. And I am the witness. The results of fraternity, a proximity that is possible only as an openness of self. So the intentionality of the self, first of all, is openness, open to become responsible again and again in relation to the other. So the outlook of openness, disposition of openness on the part of the self, and Levinas says it's an imprudent exposure to the other. Imprudent exposure because you don't know what's going to happen. Prudence tends to have some idea of what's about to happen, and so I go this direction or not. In the case of exposure to the other, I am entirely at risk. I'm subject to what may transpire in the looking the other in the eye, being looked in the eye by the other, awaiting the voice of the other. What does the other have to say? What is the other situation? And when we let the said play out, the responsibilities mount for the self. Oh, you need money. Oh, you need help. Oh, you need someone to listen. And the responsibility increases, and so does the reserves of the self. So Levinas says it's a passivity without reserve because all the reserves are opened. All the storeroom of my resources are unlocked and made accessible to the other, to the point of substitution, Levinas says. So this again is a quote from his most mature work, his second magnum opus, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. And he uses the language of substitution for the other, not only responsibility for the other, but a responsibility that runs all the way to substituting oneself for the other. Your plight is my plight. Your fight is my fight. Your misery is my misery. Your situation becomes mine. I give myself to you, for you, to substitute myself for you because I recognize that's the point of being a self. This self, it's a paradox. The self comes alive to the degree that it dies in this whole matrix. The self lives to the degree that it substitutes itself for the other. Here I am yours, I am for you, therefore I am. And it's a paradox because we could say with Levinas, I am precisely because I am not. I don't insist on being the center of the universe. I don't insist that everything comes to me, including the other one who faces me, as resource for me, as object of use for me, as tool to get ahead. So it's a paradox. The self advances to the degree that he retreats, that he surrenders, that he gives in, that he yields to the chase of the call of the other, to the face of the other, becoming responsible to the point of substitution. So subjectivity become substitutionary for this. It's very radical. It's very radical in Levinas. And of course, the questions go off in our minds. How is this lived practically speaking? How is this lived in dailiness, in the concrete? We can talk more about those things. But first are these points of recognition about one's clear, indubitable vocation to live for the other. Indubitable, more certain than Cartesian, than the Cartesian cogito. More certain than this. It's amazing. Uh, more certain than epistemological certainty because we're talking about vocational certainty, ethical certainty. So clear that we're not even talking about certainty, but assurance. Assurance through the witness, the assurance of being called, the assurance of being called to the witness stand. Here I am on the witness stand. This much is certain, this much is true, compared to any quest for any epistemological certainty. So, second, the saying for Levinas is announced in the said voice of the one who opens himself in passivity to responsibility for the other, saying, Here I am, a response that brings me out of invisibility, out of the shadow in which my responsibility could have been evaded. So this is no game of hide and seek for Levinas. Responsibility is no longer hiding, no longer insulating oneself, no longer living according to the index of self-care, we could say. And if there's self-care, it's always for the sake of the other, in relation to the other. But it's a great paradox because, again, the self lives, the self develops, the self grows to the degree that the self is given up to the point of abandonment, to the point of substitution, oneself for another, coming out of the shadows. The secret of Yejus is broken here in that there remains no need to become invisible when one is living justly. So in Plato's Republic, he talks about this character, Yejus, who finds a ring that when turned a certain way, he becomes invisible. And what does he do when he becomes invisible? Commits all these crimes, of course. Gets away with murder, so to speak, because he's invisible. And so he does all these things that are criminal, that are selfish, as if human nature will do this if it can get away with it. It's very Hobbesian, Machiavellian. So Plato in his Republic, the secret of Aegis, the secret of the ring. This is a different interpretation of not so much human nature, but the human vocation as a self, of not remaining in the shadows, of not wanting to be invisible, but wanting to live one's life in the light. And we have nothing to hide when we are committed in a covenantal relationship with justice. And when we are at the service of the call of the other, there is no darkened conscience here. Conscience itself has the greatest clarity, and without scrupulosity, because already scrupulous, out of mature responsibility for the other. A neutral laity is begotten upon the emergence of the third party within the surplus of sociality, stretching the you-I dialogue to a social trio demanding the law of justice. The third party arrives on the scene besides the I and the thou. It's neutral laity that brings with it, the third party, the demands of justice within this surplus of sociality we call society. And therefore, we need laws, we need due process, we need um, a penal system, that everyone would be accountable to this justice between others. But first, before the third party, is oneself and the other. And this is the primary relationship in which all lived experience happens. In obedience to order, in obedience to the order of signification given to the one who accepts responsibility for the other, one becomes a prophet, bearing the other in the same, announcing a word that does not originate with oneself, but proceeds from another, namely a word of glory. Levinas, in his basic philosophical writing, says that prophesying is pure testimony, pure because prior to all disclosure, it is subjection to an order before understanding the order. So, in addition to living as a witness, this self lives as prophet to the degree that the voice of the other wells up in the self. The voice of the other is spoken in the self. So the self is witness, prophet, through the here I am. Me voici, even simply saying, hello, bonjour, good day, hello. There is a response to the proximity of the other. We never knew that just saying hello to someone is prophecy, but it is. Levinas is saying, the après vous, after you, bonjour, me voici, après vous, uh, yielding to the other this word that, even if it's said first in the conversation, is a response to the hidden yet real, ethically charged call of the other in the direction of the self. So the self is prophet in very simple acts in relation to the other. Hello, after you. It's an affirmative response of responsibility for the other. How devastating it is to walk by someone, you try to make eye contact, and they don't look at you. They don't say hello. So we have the experience on the flip side, which is not Levinas's point, but through the negative, we can understand what he's getting at, in the neediness of the other to be validated in his or her call. I'm avoiding the language of being in his existence because it could sound too metaphysical. But here, the need for validation in the other, the yearning of the look of solicitude, care, concern, perhaps even love, the look of responsibility, mature responsibility. I think we all have the experience of being looked at as a means to an end by someone, and it doesn't feel good at all. Instead of being looked at by a very caring mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, teacher, someone who looks at you and you can tell it's a mature look of, I don't look at you to get anything in return. There's no economy of exchange, as Marion would call it, in this kind of look. And so that the self bears the power to look at the other in this way, to return the glance of the other, to return the greeting of the other, and even to initiate one, because the call of the other is a constant. The other is speaking uh, constantly, without without relief. The call of the other is constant, and so the witness of the self is meant to be constant. The prophecy, the prophetic vocation of the self in relation to the other is meant to be a constant. This is what Levinas is getting at. And he calls this a word of glory. The word of prophecy is a word of glory because it's anchored in the infinite. Anchored in the infinite. The word of the infinite comes through the first comer of the other, through the other's call to the self. And the prophetic responsorial witness of the self is anchored in the infinite, and it's a word of glory. The prophetic here I am of the self is a word of glory because the resonance reaches to the infinite, all the way back to the saying, the said, all of this stuff that transpires between the self and the other, the said, is filled with glory. It's filled with resonance, reverberation. Uh, and Levinas will use the language of light and illumination, but it's metaphorical. It's doubly metaphorical because he doesn't want to refer to manifestation in all of this. He doesn't want to refer to what he calls the plasticity of manifestation. He wants to refer to the signification of the infinite, and through the call of the other become prophecy in the self. The signification. So that's why I'm using more oral kinds of language, like the resonance of this of the signification, the reverberation, this timbre of prophecy, the quality of the texture of the word that bears with it the glory of the infinite, the transcendence of the infinite, the ethical heights of the infinite. So, this prophetic voice, the glory of the infinite, is the one that, Levinas says, commands me from my own mouth. When I speak to the other, I'm always already spoken to through the call of the other. And the other commands me, puts an obligation on me to be responsible for her. And this prophetic command itself is coming in my own speech. What do I have to do with the other? Even if I were to say that, already I'm witness to the call that came first, the proximity of the other that comes first. The other is, after all, the premier venu, the first comer. And so it's a great paradoxical commandment proceeding from the other, but is issued from my own lips. And whatever I say to the other, even if it's mean, even if it's a slur, even if it's get away from me, it's still saying, because you are near me, because you've always been near me. And so this is so very interesting. Thus, subjectivity takes on an ambiguity and ambivalence in which the infinite does not announce itself as a theme, but is attested to in the said that points to the saying. The accusative, here I am, by which I testify to the infinite. It is here that I am, Levinas says in his basic philosophical writings, it is here that I am The author of what was, without my knowledge, inspired in me, to have received whence we know not, that of which I am the author. It's an incredible paradox. The prophet is the author of a speech, a saying, a text that he actually did not create on his own. His more the authorial mouthpiece, paradoxical authorial witness. And so to be inspired by the call of the other is not to invent it, it's to receive something without one's prior knowledge. But it comes before knowledge, before even recognizing, but eventually recognized through the said, through this proximity. But overall, it's an inspiration. It's an inspiration within the self from an elsewhere, from a location of otherwise than the self. So Levinas calls this movement glory. Glory of the infinite is glorified in its absence, in its otherness, in the testimony of the trace in which the infinite speaks only to disappear therein, having already come in the disguise of the stranger and her demand on me. Only in alterity is love possible, is responsibility possible. Love, whose very possibility lies in its negativity. So, if we're to think these last few lines of Levinas, the possibilities of love between the self and the other, the possibilities of love here. Love is possible, yes, as gift, yes, as feeling, as movement, as ecstatic movement of oneself toward the other, because the other to the self. Love is possible between others, personal others, because a constant absence is renewing itself therein within this ethical relationship. There's love because there is an evacuation of presence to be filled with the movement. I don't want to say presence. I don't want to say manifestation because this is not the language of Levinas. Gift a little bit, but he's reluctant to use the language of gift because the language of gift itself implies too much presence, manifestation, being, object. But what we have here is this prophetic movement of responsibility for the other that indeed is evidenced in the material goods that are supplied for the other. So something like the corporal works of mercy, as they've come to be known in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is what Levinas is talking about. As Ignatius Loyola says, love is known more by deeds than by words. So with Levinas, we don't just have a speaking about love, a verbal testimony of love. We do have its incarnation in the self for the other. The self and the body of the self given up for the sake of the other. So something like maternity is one of the premier examples Levinas talks about, what he means by the self living in responsibility for the other, the mother in relation to her child, the father in relation to his child. This is concrete lived responsibility for the other. And what deserves the name love? Deserves the name love. So love, its positivity lies in its negativity. That is, there's a lack to fill. Therefore, there is much loving to be done. There is a struggle and suffering of the other. Therefore, there is much responsibility to exercise. So, because of the lack in the other, The self has much work to do in relation to the other, but it begins with a lack and is sustained by a lack. As Levinas says, the hungers of desire for the other are renewed through the other's ongoing needs, and also the lack within the self of itself. This denucleation of the self, Levinas talks about a denucleation of the self in which desire moves, from which desire proceeds. So there's a paradoxical lack, filling, renewed lack, renewed filling in this ethical matrix. The transcendence of glory, the upward anchor of love, signifies the vertical dimension of testimony, that sense of elevation that is prior to objectivity, culture, aesthetics, and consciousness, an elevation that ordains being and gives rise to the phenomenon of erecting altars that extend toward the heavens. The glory of the significance of the trace of the infinite, the trace of the saying in the said, consists in signifying without making appear. If it establishes a relation with eleity, a relation personal and ethical, a relation, obligation that does not unveil, if consequently the trace does not belong to phenomenology, to comprehension of appearance and dissimulation, it could at least be approached by another path, by situating that significance from the phenomenology that it interrupts. So this is radical phenomenology that lets itself be interrupted in its discourse of manifestation. That goes back to Husserl, Heidegger is renewed with Marion and about every other phenomenologist. So this is uh, ethical eroticism. Ethical eroticism that does not demand an unveiling, that does not desire a consumption of beauty, and then is every time disappointed. Ethical eroticism, Levinas is talking about, he talks about eros in Totality and Infinity, for example, but it's an eros, it's a desire that is awakened by alterity, yes, but in a desire that is predestined to go the distance in its desire by renouncing the temptation to reduce the other to more of the same through this gross, greedy, avaricious, bestial attempt to devour the other as an object, as a means to an end. So this is what Levinas says is the difference between love and lust. Chastity is always involved in love because this disposition of chastity, of self-mastery, refuses to let the other come as a piece of food, a piece of food. Within the ethical relationship, we recognize in the personalism of the other an irreducibility to use, even to epistemological assimilation. I cannot know the other completely. With the call of the other, with, yes, the dignity of the other, there comes the ethical demands of modesty, of propriety, of a resistance to any kind of promiscuous grasp, manipulation, even in one's premeditated thoughts, where all of this grasping begins. So, what Levinas is contributing to philosophy is something, again, incredible, because he's he's helping to awaken conscience through this alterity, this personal alterity of the call of the other, into a vocational situation in which the self does not experience some privilege of decision in it all. But the self, for Levinas, is always already summoned, is always already exposed before the world. And this is the great illusion in postmodernity, that the self can go about life as if no one else sees, no one else notices, nobody else is paying attention. But what Levinas is saying is the reality of lived experience and all its significations is that there is an accountability that is constant in one's life, and one will have to make a reckoning in the future about how one lived in this flesh, in thought, word, and deed, accountable to the other. And the other is the judge, the eschatological judge, about how did I do as a self? Did I live in responsibility or not? There is a testament being formulated along the way. And Levinas is saying this is not some theological overlay of the actual state of affairs, of lived experience. Um, these are the very fibers of lived experience, the vis-a-vis oneself and the other, always in relation to the other. So there will be a day of reckoning, a day of vindication. And so Levinas, it's a radical vocative reduction, posing a threat to the hubris of phenomenology itself. As a trace of the infinite, the alaity of the ethical relationship disrupts the synchronous stream of phenomenological manifestation for the ego. Proclamation collides with manifestation to say that the other cannot be described in terms of unveiling, aletheia, the Greek word for truth, the concept of a disclosure or appearance alone. The other cannot be described according to manifestation, appearance, or aletheia. Levinas claims to recognize a command from eternity that plays itself out in the intersubjective demands of justice. He locates this command at the heart of the drama of the people of Israel. Torah is Jewish Mosaic law, especially the first 5 books of the Tanakh, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This Torah is a summons from the depths of eternity, a summons that expresses an immovable actuality prior to all possible responses, descriptions, and testimonies, expressing itself in the possibilities of responsibility. So there we had a transgression of phenomenology itself through the language of actuality. We remember that in Being and Time, Heidegger says, higher than actuality stands possibility. But what Levinas is saying here is lower than possibility stands actuality. And it's a reversal. It's a very intentional subversion of the Heideggerian egocentric privileging of possibility. But for Levinas, it's a subversion of this and getting back to the anchor of lived experience itself, which is the call of the other. That is expressed in terms of, yes, ultimately religious belief and practice in the Jewish Torah, law, instruction, testimony, teaching. So, even though Levinas does not describe the infinite or the saying in terms of actuality, I find it helpful to do so in order to set up the return to classic metaphysics as a timeless expression of transcendence and as the unexpected threshold of phenomenological inquiry. And so, this Levinas, in his own words, has some reference to this non-phenomenality of the call of the other. And so, but it's also a very metaphysical move without becoming explicit classical metaphysics. Really, this we can call this actuality that precedes the possibilities of possibility. For this reason, the saying itself in Levinas is non-phenomenological because it is pure actuality. It is constant behind the scenes, an actuality that necessarily goes before all potentiality and possibility, but nevertheless is attested in the latter, and all the potencies of the said and the traces of the saying of the infinite that show up there. So, in his essay, The Temptation of Temptation, for instance, Levinas writes, the adherence to the good of those who said, now this is a passage from Torah, we will do and we will hear. It's very interesting. He's from Hebrew scripture. The people of Israel, as they receive the command of God, they already have a disposition of no matter what it is, we will do and we will hear. So the hearing even coming after the commitment, the covenantal commitment of responsibility in relation to this command from the infinite. It's not the result of a choice between good and evil. It comes before it. This undoubtedly indicates that the doing which is at stake here is not simply praxis, as opposed to theory, but a way of, now here's where Levinas uses the language of actuality, a way of actualizing without beginning with the possible, of knowing without examining, of placing oneself beyond violence, without this being the privilege of a free choice. A pact with good would exist preceding the alternative of good and evil. So Levinas is saying that this ethical injunction, the command ultimately to be responsible for the other and to have something to do with God in and through the call of the other. So for Judaism, the face of the other, the call of the other, Levinas says, is where God comes to mind, not apart from this ethical relationship. But we have here uh, what Levinas calls the freedom of the non-choice. It's an incredible concept of freedom that's very different than the popular one in culture today. Freedom as choice, getting to choose this or that. But for Levinas, we have a freedom without choice because freedom is opened by way of responsibility. It is through lived responsibility that freedom is carved out for the other and oneself. Freedom is made. Freedom is made not through a choice between good and evil at all, because that makes no sense. To choose what is evil, one becomes less free. Our examination of lived experience teaches us as much. But one becomes free the more goodness is chosen. Goodness that is found within a network of responsibilities. There's no claim to human rights without lived human responsibilities. This is what Levinas is getting at. Again, it's a paradoxical freedom that is one to the degree that the self surrenders in responsibility for the other. So then in his book Time and the Other, Levinas writes, he's honest and says, I have not proceeded in a phenomenological way. The continuity of development is that of a dialectic starting with the identity of hypostasis, which is the identity of the self with itself. The Greek word hypostasis, that can mean substance or person. The enchainment of the ego to the self, moving toward the maintenance of this identity, toward the maintenance of the existence. That's not what he's after, but he says, in a liberation of the ego with regard to the self. The concrete situation that the concrete situations that have been analyzed represent the accomplishment of this dialectic. The situations he was analyzing in the book, Time and the Other. So a dialectic between the ego and the self. They're not the same thing, and we have a movement of the liberation of the ego with regard to the self. So the ego, the I, is liberated from the self itself through this self-forgetfulness. The self becomes an I because of the you, in response to the you, the other who calls. And in his book, Entre nous, Between Us, Levinas writes, in knowledge, one is two, even when one is alone. So there's an alterity of consciousness through self-reflection that, again, is produced by the alterity of the other outside the self and the exteriority in relation to the interiority of consciousness. So the ego, there can be a cleavage between the ego and the self because of the other who faces me. Through the ethical relationship, the ego is born in a cleavage between the ego and the self, in which knowledge is always two, even in solitude when one is alone. Levinas says this is the excellence of the multiple, which evidently can be thought as a degradation of the one. But it's a happy degradation. It's actually an upgrade of the solitude of the one, who is nothing without the other. To cite another verse, created man is blessed with the command to multiply. So he's quoting from Genesis 2:24, Hashem, God, saying to the first human beings, be fruitful and multiply. So he's saying this religious text is testifying to the excellence of the multiple and the excellence of the dialectic itself, the excellence of the more than one, of the plurality of persons that results in a fruit being born. In ethical and religious terms, you will have someone to love. You will have someone for whom to exist. You cannot be just for yourself. God created them, man and woman, at the outset. Man and woman created God them, to put it in that linguistic order. Man and woman created Hashem them. So the name God, the Lord created them, and as much as there is a them, there is a more than one, including sexual difference itself that attests to the excellence of multiplicity, of difference, of otherness of persons. We recall too the ancient rabbinic methods of biblical exegesis, such as remez, in which allegorical meanings are unfolded from the text in proportion to the multiplicity of texts and paradigms brought together in proximity. For example, in narrative discourse, parabolic discourse, apocalyptic discourse, altogether, Jewish Mishnah, the art of rabbinic interpretation, Gemara, Talmud, all of these ways of interpreting the text through a conflict of interpretations showcase the excellence of multiplicity. So all this is to suggest that at the threshold of possibility for phenomenology, the possibility of possibility is the possibility of actuality. And moreover, the admission that possibility depends on it. So in the very end here, we have a metaphysical turnover, a metaphysical maneuver, a metaphysical moment that reawakens the veracity of actuality, even for phenomenology to proceed. If phenomenology remains in a bubble or in a vacuum apart from the whole of thought, it becomes its own reductionism. It ends up in the dead end that it was seeking to evacuate. So phenomenology needs to return to the anchor, needs to return to the whole from which it was hewn. This is again the possibility of impossibility. The impossible for phenomenology is the actual. The possibility from a finite vantage point of the infinite, the possibility of a non-possibility, namely the unpossibility called actuality. In this sense, phenomenology is interrupted by a bygone and irretrievable, what Levinas calls diachronic past, that awakens the incipient word of phenomenology, to the other who calls me. This awakening is without self-interest, as self-interest is emptied by disinterestedness toward the other. Eleity is the term that signifies the indiscriminate call of the other, of every other, which bears within itself a trace of the non-negotiable infinite. The non-negotiable infinite that comes as a paroxysm to the self, an eruption of things, a breaking apart, Levinas says. And in this breaking apart, without getting into the language of causality, is attributable to the infinite, to the saying that precedes every said, from which the call of the other springs forth. Levinas' notion of eleity can be likened to Paul Ricoeur's notion of the absolute. So in his book, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, Levinas writes, the saying in the said of the witness born signifies in a plot other than that which is spread out in a theme, other than that which attaches a noesis to a noema, a cause to an effect, the memorable past to the present. The plot of the saying being signified in the said connects to what detaches itself absolutely, to the absolute. So there we have another term to add to the Levinasian nomenclature. Infinite saying absolute. Paul Ricoeur has a lot to say about the absolute, that through its self-attestation within conscience and the necessary divestment of the self to receive and live toward the absolute, that which is not dissolvable, you can't partition it anymore. It's the ultimate concept in philosophy. But all of these together are ultimate concepts that form a chorus of concepts, that which is not directly accessible, that which is not immediate to consciousness, that which consciousness cannot circumscribe by a thought, more than panoramic, but we're talking about something that shows up within lived experience only ever as a trace. So Levinas too, like Ricoeur, uses the language of absolute to express the plot, the ethical plot of the signification of the saying and the said. Levinas goes on to say the detachment of the infinite from the thought that seeks to thematize it and the language that tries to hold it in the said is what we have called eleity. So there we have another definition by Levinas about eleity means for him, again, the detachment of the infinite from the thought that seeks to thematize it. To thematize the thought of the infinite would be to give it more definitions, and try to lock it into one way or maybe just a handful of ways to understand it. But the infinite is elusive as a concept for philosophy, that its meaning is never exhausted. It's always more interesting uh, to try to understand, to try to think. So the detachment of the infinite from the thought that seeks to thematize it and the language that tries to hold it in the said is what we have called eleity. So for Levinas, there is an eleity that runs from the absolute, the saying, the infinite, all the way to the self. And it's eleity because we have this, we could say, this detachment, as he puts it, this difference between the infinite, the saying, the absolute, and any way that it is talked about in the said. So even in this scheme, uh, it's um, it's a little misleading because by writing these words, they're already involved in the said. But what Levinas is getting at within lived experience is there's a sense of these uh, things through their signification that language itself cannot bring into the world of manifestation as another object, as another tool, uh, as another form of givenness or gegebenheit. But instead, there's something that is very elusive about, I'll say, origin. Nobody is there at the creation of the universe, as he says. And these terms already being betrayed in their names, uh, still awaken the origin that proceeds all the way through the call of the other to the self, and their signification that's lighting up in the intersubjective relationship. So just a couple more points and we'll conclude this live stream. This is eleity. So it's eleity. There's a otherness, a redoubled otherness of the infinite, the saying, the absolute, in relation to the other who faces me. One is tempted to call this plot religious. It is not stated in terms of certainty or uncertainty and does not rest on any positive theology. So that's a quote from Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. Only a trace of the absolute of eleity can be detectable on the horizon of phenomenality via an ethical, sincere, and veracious proclamation of testimony. So in his basic philosophical writings, Levinas says, my responsibility for the other is precisely this relation with an unthematizable infinity. It is neither the experience of infinity nor proof of it. The ethical relation with the other, my responsibility for the other, testifies to infinity. This testimony is not appended to a subjective experience in order to proclaim the ontological conjuncture disclosed by the subject. This testimony belongs to the very glory of the infinite. It is the saying that, unencumbered by any possessions in being, achieves the extradition of sincerity. No said recovers sincerity, and none is adequate to it. Saying without said, apparently a talking for nothing, a sign given to the other as a simple hello. And within the saying, a sign given of this giving of a sign, the pure transparency of confession, testimony. So The testimony of ethical sincerity is evidence of the saying, of the infinite for Levinas. And it's a sincerity of intention, but an intention that must be expressed in the flesh, in and through material goods. As Levinas says, this sincerity of ethical responsibility, he's calling testimony, is evidenced by tearing the bread out of my own mouth and giving it to the other. For example, so these corporal works of mercy, these alms givings of a person, of the self toward the other, that sincerity, ethical sincerity of responsibility is the testimony to the infinite. Sincerity is the key word. In the game, he says that activates the cultural keyboard of language. Sincerity and testimony signify through the very ambiguity of every said, through the greeting it offers to the other, the resounding in the name of God of all language. But prophecy, through its ambiguities, is not the last resort of a lame revelation. It belongs to the glory of the infinite. So what Levinas is getting at here is there's an ambiguity of every said, every word that's spoken, every philosophical project. It can be called into question, analyzed, reflected upon. But what is most decisive, determinate for thought is the sincerity of the witness in relation to the other. This is where we can say the proof is in the pudding. The sincerity of the ethical responsibility of one for the other, especially to the point of martyrdom. The one who gives up his or her life for the sake of the other to the point of abandonment can't be called into question because we can't say they did it for some other reason, that they could get more money, that they could become famous, that they could enjoy more pleasure on earth. They gave up everything to the point of exhaustion without remainder. And this is the sincerity Levinas is talking about. A heroic saintliness, he says, that is an integrity of action that is not contingent on any reward, where a self acts without promises, without saying, well, I'm doing this so I can get this other thing, even on the hindsight of death. So, for this thinking in Hebrew, within this very much Jewish influence context of Levinas, it is a kind of a sober responsibility that does the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Pure and simple. I don't do the right thing. I don't live in responsibility for some other good, for some other end. That is the ultimate end in itself, inasmuch as that end of action, that kind of action, is tethered to the infinite, the saying, the absolute. There's no other layers to peel back. Responsibility is the witness, is the testimony, is the prophecy of the infinite. And at the limit, martyrdom. At the limit. And it's a kind of inspired act that doesn't make sense within the finite order of being. Martyrdom itself attests to a transcendent alterity of the infinite. And it's an absolute point of departure and point of arrival. In other words, testimony is not proof positive of transcendence or infinity as a theme, or you could say per se, or as a concept, but simply an ambiguous trace of an anarchic saying, because we can't detect the arche, its substance or foundation directly, to which I attest in my encounter with the face of the other. Insofar as I speak, I give witness to that which speaks in me, the inspiration of the call of the other that obliges me to become responsible for her. So, in sum, the Esgibt of manifestation in the phenomenology of Husserl, Heidegger, Marion, it's modified in that of Levinas. As informed by the work of Levinas to an Esgibt aus, it gives as an Esgibt nach. It gives according to the witness within his phenomenology of proclamation. What gives as the saying of the infinite, a trace in my affirmative responsorial said, here I am, to the other who beckons me. What gives in the work of Levinas gives according to the prophetic witness of my affirmative response to the other. A word of the other, l'autrui, spoken in the same, moi. Phenomenality is awakened by a proclaimed word issued from eternity and attested in intersubjective discourse of uprightness. A covenant relationship is established between me and the other in what Levinas calls the peace of proximity, because through the nakedness of the face of the other, and moreover the signification of the call of the other, the signification lighting up from the other is do not kill me. If I respond affirmatively to that command and I refuse to kill the other, we have peace, the peace of proximity through my recognition and of an affirmative response to the command of the other, do not kill me. So we can form a covenant relationship established between me and the other according to the unevadable leverage of the other's call and my responsibility for him. I am my brother's keeper. After all, that's a very colloquial takeaway from the philosophy of Levinas. I am my brother's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. Fraternity, sorority, peace of proximity. Emmanuel Levinas, Ethics as First Philosophy. So we're seeing in these pages, again, most of the commentary taken from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist and Etude in Phenomenology, forward by Jean-Luc Marion, who also is very influenced by Levinas. But what we're seeing here in the work of Levinas is that we can say thinking in Hebrew, influenced by Judaism, in which he was raised and lived till he died, and all the insights coming from this tradition of thought, this tradition of ethical monotheism, and the primacy of the call of the other, the mature vocation to live in responsibility for the other. It's a phrase I could say it all day long, the rest of my life, every day, because it bears the character of the infinite. It never gets old. As soon as I sign off this live stream, I will continue. And my responsibility for the other, to do the live stream itself, has to do with responsibility for the other. Is my primary motivation. It's for the sake of which. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, either now or later in the comment section after the video is published. But as always, I thank you for joining me in these reflections, the work of Emmanuel Levinas. I want to continue on in future live streams with commentary based on my 2021 book entitled Emmanuel, Levinas and Variations on God with Us. To think more of the meaning of thinking in Hebrew and trying to understand this work of Levinas even better. There's so much to understand within it. It's really a labyrinth of thoughts, a very generous, hospitable labyrinth of thoughts, in which the minotaur of the self is slayed in the center, because the labyrinth is expanded through its twists and turns, its unicursal path that expands according to the excellence of multiplicity, and the minotaur of the self is slayed by living in responsibility for the other. So if there's any questions, comments, you can put them in the chat. Otherwise, I look forward to the next live stream, the next rendezvous of learning together. And what a privilege it is to study a great thinker of the 20th century, Emmanuel Levinas. So to understand phenomenology, we have to keep learning all the way through Levinas. Way too many phenomenological proposals don't include Levinas, don't include any reference to Levinas, and it's very sad because what he's adding to the phenomenological scheme to understand phenomenality in this elliptical ethical relationship with the other is incredibly valuable and I would say after the fact true. Coming back to a phenomenology of manifestation, it's what manifestation lacks: proclamation, ethics, testimony, prophecy, witness, speech, discourse, interpretation, hermeneutics, responsibility for the other. Philosophy, after all, is not meant to end in a solipsistic self congratulation of contemplating well, of developing great theory through speculative thought. But there's a payoff when we think of the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, for instance, alongside the ancient Hebrews, where Jerusalem and Athens meet, we find ethics. We find ethical existence. And if philosophy doesn't go that distance, it will short circuit, it will collapse on the way, and it will be a very miserable and miserly ending to a great adventure begun. So, thank you so much. If there's no questions and comments for this live stream, we'll sign it off. May we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.